I've been fortunate enough to work with dozens of different publishers over my time in the board game industry. And for the most part, my experiences working with those publishers has been very positive, and we've been able to make great games together. But as you might guess, any working relationship can always be improved. In this video, I want to propose 5 main areas or things that I think publishers could generally improve on in their way of working with designers that would improve that relationship immensely. Some of these are relatively small, and some of them require a bit of a bigger shift in the way that we think about working between designers and publishers, but hopefully they'll all be useful. Hi, I'm Matthew Dunstan. I'm a full-time board game designer based in Australia, and to date I've had over 60 games published all around the world. On this channel I like to talk about all things game design, including what it's like being a full-time game designer in the industry, and my experiences, and also tips and tricks to help newer designers develop their craft and make better games. So straight away, I want to say this video is really meant as constructive feedback to publishers. It's not aimed at any one publisher in particular, and so if any of my publishers are watching this is not a coded way of trying to give you a message about how to improve our relationship. This video is more about the accumulation of different experiences I've had over the years working in the industry, over 10 years working with different publishers, and some of the common problems I see that come up in those working relationships, and some possible solutions that might improve it, or in fact head off the problem before it even becomes a problem. One of the things I want to be able to do on this channel is to advocate for designers and to improve their lot in the wider game industry. And one of the ways to do that is to share my experiences and my thoughts about how to improve things that might empower other designers to do the same. So, area of improvement number 1, communication. Communication is a pretty broad area of the relationship between designers and publishers, but it's something I experience time and time again, which could simply be improved. One element of that is organization. Often, the way that publishers will communicate with designers is very last moment or at the moment when something needs to be done. There have been many times where I've signed a game with a publisher and we've signed the contract, and then I don't hear from them for 3 or 4 months down the road. And I presume things are happening, but I don't really know. And then I'll get an email out of nowhere asking me to proofread a rulebook or proofread a number of cards or look at the layout of a board or other components for the game. And they'll tell me that they need me to do that in the next 3 or 4 days because they're about to go to print with the game, or they're about to prepare prototypes to send out to reviewers, maybe in advance of a Kickstarter campaign. And this really is not the best way to communicate with a designer. It makes it very hard for us to plan our working schedule when we can get an email out of nowhere that suddenly asks us to do this big amount of work that we weren't expecting to do. And not only that, it compresses the amount of time we have to spend on what can be very important tasks. Designers care about the games that they're going to publish, as I'm sure publishers do as well. And when you ask us to proofread important aspects of the game, especially the rulebook, we want to do a really good job. But if you don't leave us very much time to do that job, our choices are either to do a substandard job, which risks a bad reception for the game, which none of us want, or it forces us to work long hours in those few days you've given us to work on doing that task, which is not a very healthy state of working for the designer. And sometimes the other problem with communication is there just simply isn't any communication. Often emails won't go answered for weeks and months on end. And this can be the case not only when you've signed a game, but when you have a game sitting with a publisher and they're considering it for publication. I'm not saying that designers should be able to hound publishers to get answers for their emails or answers about prototypes that have submitted them. But if designers have gone through the right process of contacting and pitching to a publisher, such as meeting with them at a convention, and then that publisher decides to take the prototype away with them from that convention, I think it's reasonable that the designer can expect a somewhat timely response, or at least a response to an email asking what the state of their prototype is. I often advocate emailing a publisher, say about 3 months after giving them a prototype, and I think it's a reasonable expectation that a publisher might have been able to look at the game in that time, or at least should respond to an email asking what the state of the game is, even if it's just to say, I'm sorry, we haven't had time to look at it. But unfortunately, not responding to that email at all, I think is just disrespectful to the designer who's entrusted you with their prototype. Again, I'm not saying that you need to have a huge long answer to their email, but at least acknowledging it and giving them that bit of information, which might simply be, I'm sorry, we haven't tested it yet. This is one clear example where publishers don't communicate well with designers, but it can happen at a lot of different stages along the process of working with a publisher. Another aspect of communication is the mode for which that communication is going to take place between the designer and the publisher. And if there's any way to make that as easy and as concise a way as possible, I think both parties will really benefit. Publishers often have their own ways that they communicate internally, often through different types of software, whether it's Discord or Basecamp or some other kind of project management software. And it can be a bit tough for us designers because we have to adapt to a different system for every different publisher that we're going to work with. For the publisher, that's the only system they work with, so they only have to get used to one. I think a great thing that publishers can do is really help to onboard designers into that method of communication, if it's a very specific one, and to make it as easy as possible for them to communicate through it. More and more I'm coming around to the idea of using something other than email. Email is fine leading up to the point of maybe signing a contract. You're not necessarily sending a lot of emails back and forth, and there's not a lot of point in investing in some other type of technology that you're going to use. But once a game is signed, and you might be exchanging a lot of information between the designer and the publisher, especially around the development of the game, I'm thinking more and more that moving to something like Discord or similar is a much better way of storing that information and communicating effectively. In my inbox, I definitely have some email threads which are 100, 200 emails long between myself and a publisher. And at some point, it simply becomes unwieldy to search and find particular pieces of information which are hidden amongst those 200 emails in a thread. And that's where project software is actually really useful. Often there are places which you can store files and keep the most up-to-date version of a file or a prototype so that they're always easy to find. And if you have a thread or a forum where you're discussing a game back and forth, often it's a lot easier to find previous responses or even search for things within those responses, which are often a lot better than search within an email. This isn't a criticism per se, but it's more of an area of opportunity for publishers to think about what they're setting up for the methods they're going to communicate with designers. And there are much more effective ways than others. Improvement number 2, hiring and paying specialists instead of relying on the designer. Once you've signed a game with a publisher, there are lots of different tasks that need to be done to work on that game and prepare it to be sent to market. You've got the actual development of the game, writing the rulebook, laying out the cards, the rulebook, other components for the game, preparing those files for print, making illustrations and graphic design, working with the factory to manufacture the game, sending those copies out to reviewers or to shops, and working on different marketing materials for the game. It's a long list of tasks, and there's a lot of different skills that are needed to perform those tasks, a lot of different skills. And some of these are very specialist skills, especially around things like editing, development, and marketing. And I talk about these skills in another video, which I'll link to up here. What I see happening sometimes between publishers and designers, especially when the publisher is smaller, and maybe that publisher is only 1 or 2 people, and they're sharing a lot of hats, they're having to do a lot of differently skilled jobs. They rely on the designer to do a lot of jobs which are not necessarily the designer's responsibility ultimately. And not only are they not really the responsibility of the designer might not have the skill set to do that job effectively. I talked a bit earlier about getting a rulebook and being asked to proofread and edit it. Put aside the problem of having to do that job quickly. But sometimes, even if I had the most time in the world, I might not be the best person to edit or proofread a document. Those are very specific skill sets that you get trained for, that you get certifications for. And it's very likely that I'm going to miss things because I'm not specifically trained in those things. Those aren't my specific skill sets. And depending on you as a designer, you might be better or worse at this. My point in all of this is really to encourage publishers to invest resources into hiring people or contracting people who have these specific skill sets to do these specific tasks, and to not necessarily leave them to the designer to do in concert with you. Not only does that improve the final product, which I think everybody wants. That's the goal that we all share. We want to make the best game and release it to the public. And using a rulebook editor who is specifically trained in that is going to produce a much better rulebook than if only the publisher or designer work on that rulebook. There have definitely been a few times where a game has been released and I've realized that, I've just missed something in when I've been trying to proofread the rules or trying to edit them. And that's going to happen because I'm not an editor. And while I completely understand editors aren't free, I would really encourage publishers to bake that cost into the overall cost of developing and producing a game. And the other thing about that is that you respect the designer's time more. We as designers want to be involved in the process, and I would always want to be able to have the option of proofreading a rulebook before it goes to print. But I don't necessarily want to have to edit the whole thing. I don't think that's a really fair use of my time, and nor is it really covered by any contract. Rarely do you see a term of a contract which requires the designer to be editing the rules. Again, this isn't a direct criticism, but just an area of improvement in the way that a publisher can approach these skilled tasks. I would include things like marketing and development in that as well. Especially with development, I'm a firm proponent of having someone specifically tasked with developing the game who isn't the designer. It's the way to ensure that you're going to make the best game by having another set of eyes on the project and suggesting improvements or different ways to do things. that external developer or that new person is going to see things that neither the publisher or the designer might have ever thought of. And in the best case, I can remember really clearly when a developer who was working on one of my games suggested a change that made the game infinitely better, made it simpler to play, and we were all the better for it. But I would have never thought about it without their contribution. Again, and unfortunately what tends to happen, especially when working with smaller publishers, is that you get stuck into the development of the game, and often it turns out to be a much bigger task than either party was prepared for. And it ends up with both the publisher and the designer putting in a lot of time and effort to work on the game that wasn't really budgeted for. And on the designer's side, not only is it something that maybe you're not as skilled at doing, or you're not going to produce as good a result as if you'd got an external developer in, and it's using up a lot of your time, which I would say wasn't exactly what the agreement was when you signed the game with that publisher. Another aspect of this improvement is that often I think designers are put in quite a difficult position with publishers, and it's not really the fault or intention of the publishers to put us in this position, but often we're put in the position of either we spend a lot more time and effort to work on a game to make it better, really to make up for the lack of other skilled people working on the project, or we try and respect our boundaries and not spend so much time on the game, but with the guilt that comes from thinking that, well, the game's not going to be very good, or I haven't given all my effort to make it the best it can be. It's a really hard place to be, and so often I and many other designers just simply make the choice to work a lot more on a game, maybe to our own detriment, to our own mental health or our own time management. This part, combined with the earlier part about lack of communication, means that planning your work as a full-time designer can be incredibly difficult. You don't know week to week what tasks you're going to be doing, and nor do you know the size of those tasks that you're going to be doing. And while it might be tough with one project, if you start getting multiple projects in these same states that come all at once, suddenly you're left with a whole amount of work that you're very emotionally tied to, and you don't have much support to be able to do that work. Again, publishers and designers are in it together to try and make the best game possible. We have the same goal, and these are just suggestions to try and get there more reliably and while respecting each other's time and expertise. Improvement number 3, respecting contractual obligations. So the main two things that I see in contracts that a publisher has to give the designer when the game is going to be published are the royalties from that game, and often designer copies for that game. I've had more experiences than I care to say where I've had to chase publishers up either to get them to pay me royalties or to get them to send me my designer copies. In the case of royalties, sometimes publishers are really bad at even telling you how much of a game is sold, sending you the reports of their sales, so you don't even know how much money you're even owed. And really, I should not have to chase these reports. Something that should be in every contract is a date by which a publisher is required you to send them their sales report. Usually it's once every quarter or once every 6 months, and they have to send you a report within 1 month of that quarter or half of the year being finished. So for example, if you're looking at the second half of a year, you might expect to get the sales report by the end of January in the following year. And while a lot of publishers are great about this, and they send their sales report like clockwork, and I expect exactly when they're going to get, there are also quite a few publishers who forget or simply don't send you anything until I start chasing them up, and this simply shouldn't be required. And then once you have the sales report and you've issued your invoice to the publisher, they should be paying that as promptly as possible within 1 or 2 days. There's no reason that they should be delaying that payment. I have a spreadsheet where I track all my invoices and the progress of payment for them. I have a big green yes or no for whether an invoice has been paid or not. And there are so many times where I have to remember to check that spreadsheet, often months after I've sent an invoice, and check, hold on, this invoice hasn't been paid. I need to chase up the publisher and work out what's going on. But that's 1 or 2 months where I haven't been paid, and it requires me to go back in my records and chase up the publisher to get them to pay. And then it comes to author copies. Often players are really surprised, especially when they start asking questions about a game that's just come out, that the designer might not even have a copy of the game yet, and so it's really hard to answer questions on it. There are some of my games that have been released that I still actually haven't received copies of them yet. And while of course it's frustrating to not be able to help out and answer questions on BGG for a game, that's nothing compared to the disappointment of not being able to actually hold the game that you've worked in your hands, maybe worked on for many years, and actually play it with your friends and family who might have worked on it with you as well. In my mind, there's no excuse for members of the public to get the games before the designer does. And it's a sad part of our industry that it happens quite often. On the other hand, I've worked with publishers who have been really fantastic about this, and I've received my games sometimes months before they've been released, and that feels really special. It feels like they've really thought about me, realized how important this game is to me and to them, and they want to share that with me as soon as possible. Out of all the points on this list, where I would say a lot of these points are points of constructive criticism or feedback, and that there is some grey area about the best way to do things, for this point, there isn't any wiggle room. These requirements are contractually obligated, and it's just simply unacceptable for a publisher to not respect the terms of the agreement. And again, it's just adding to the mental load that's put onto designers, who are tasked often with chasing these things that publishers are supposed to do, and not only that they're supposed to do, but they're supposed to do without the designer telling them to do it. Improvement number 4, having a much clearer idea of what you want when you sign a game. Have you ever had the experience where you've pitched a game to a publisher and they've been really interested in the game, but it's not exactly what they want in a final product, and they think that they might want some changes? In this instance, there are 2 different things that can happen, both of which I think are a little bit problematic for the relationship between a publisher and designer. In the first instance, the publisher doesn't sign the game, but they ask the designer to go back and develop the game a bit further, more in line with what they're looking for in the game. Often the publisher will give the designer very specific feedback about different aspects of the game which they think they could be improved, or better fit into what they're looking for in a particular product. Then as a designer you go back, and it's up to you whether you want to work on the game more, but often, again, because we want to try and get our games published, you're incentivized to work on that game more, develop it, shape it into more of what the publisher is looking for. And then you'll go back to the publisher and show them the game again. Now, this process can actually repeat a number of times where you'll show the game again to the publisher, they'll ask for more improvements, some more development. You'll show it to them again, they'll ask for more improvements. And this repeats and repeats, all without having a contract, and all with taking a lot more of your time. In the second instance, where you sign a game to a publisher where they're not quite sure whether it's exactly what they want, they do sign the game. But soon after they sign the game, they want really quite drastic changes to the game that require a lot of development work, which they expect you as the designer to do to get the game to where they want it to be and the vision they have for the game. In both these cases, the fault of publishers is not really knowing exactly what they want and not communicating it clearly to the designer. And this lack of certainty and vision about what game that they want leads them to wasting the time of designers. And in the case where they're doing it before a contract, often wasting the time of designers without any payment at all. At least in the case where you sign a game, you might have at least got an advance payment. In terms of an improvement that I think publishers can get a lot better at is being much clearer about what they're looking for and being a lot more clearer in their communication once they've been pitched a game as to what they want to do with it. So in the case where you as a publisher are pitched a game which you really like, but you know is going to require some significant development to get it to where you want it to be. In that instance, the gold standard for me would be signing an option contract with the designer. So this is something you sign before the main contract, and it effectively reserves the game for a certain amount of time, say between 1 to 3 months, where you've reserved it so that the designer can't pitch it to anybody else during that time. And part of that option contract is a payment to the designer. A bit like an advance, it's a non-refundable payment, such that if at the end of the option contract you decide to not sign the game, then they get to keep that money. This option contract does a lot of things. It shows that you're serious about publishing the game. It stops this situation where a designer is sent on endless rounds of developing a game before any commitment from the publisher towards publishing the game. At least by signing an option contract, you're paying the designer for the time you're going to take to consider the game. The second thing is you can clearly set out in that option contract whether you might expect the designer to work on that game during that time. And that allows the designer to make a decision at that point of signing the contract whether they are okay with that deal or not, whether they're okay with signing up for effectively doing more work before the game is signed. Again, it's about improving the communication and clearness of what's expected in that designer-publisher relationship. And the third thing is it sets a clear deadline by which the game has to be signed. Options contracts last for a set amount of time, maybe somewhere between 1 and 3 months, and they state that when you get to the end of that option contract, those rights will automatically revert back to the designer if the game hasn't been signed by that time. So then there's a really clear timeline that the publisher has to respect in terms of making a final decision to sign the game fully. The other thing that can be done, I think, by publishers is that in the process of signing the main contract of the game, where as a publisher you want to sign the game but expect there'll be significant development done after that, is to have that conversation during the contract negotiation. Be clear with the designer with your vision for the game and the work you think that's going to have to be taken to get there. Then, as part of that conversation, you can talk with the designer who's going to do that work. Are you, the publisher, going to do that? Are you going to contract out an external developer, or do you have a developer in-house? Are you going to expect the designer to be heavily involved in the development? By having this conversation up front when you sign the contract, the designer can make their own decision about the level of commitment for their time and resources that they're going to have to make if they sign this contract with you. And there aren't any surprises after they sign the contract when suddenly they have to do a whole bunch of work that they never expected they might have to do. It's a really grey area for designers and publishers about what really should be expected in terms of development work that a designer has to do on a game post signing the game. I'm not advocating that the designer shouldn't have to do anything at all, but I'm also definitely advocating that the designer shouldn't have to do everything either. And because it's a grey area and there's not really a standard, it means that depending on the publisher, they'll interpret that part of the relationship in different ways. What I'd love to do is just to bring that communication much more into the open and at the point before the game is signed so that a designer can make an informed decision. And moreover, asking publishers to be much more critical in terms of what their vision is for a game. And please, don't sign one of our games if you don't really know what you want for it. I've definitely had a few experiences where I feel like a publisher has wanted to sign my game because they're really excited about it, but they don't necessarily have a good idea about what product they want to publish it as, and nor do they have an idea exactly how it might fit their target audience or whether they have a target audience in mind at all. If they haven't considered these things at the time of signing the contract, often later in the process, it might lead to huge changes in the game or huge amounts of work that the designer has to do. And again, then the designer is in a really tough spot. Are you happy to change everything about your game just so that it still gets published? Or do you step away from the whole process, having wasted possibly a couple of years working on the game with a publisher, and start again from scratch? It's just a really tough decision and again, takes its toll on the designer. And improvement number 5. Have a plan for how you're going to market and sell the game. As the number of games that gets released every year grows ever and ever higher, it becomes harder and harder for a new game to stand out amongst the masses. And this problem of how you're going to sell the game requires thought and effort and skill to be put in to how you're going to market the game, how you're going to tell people about it, and how you're going to encourage them to buy it. The reason I talk about this point in a video about improving the relationship with designers and publishers is this is really the part that designers have very little control over. In a lot of the previous points, at least they dealt with communication or agreements between the publisher and the designer, things that the designer could have input on, and ways that they could act to potentially influence the outcome. But marketing and distribution are usually solely what the publisher is responsible for, and the designer has very little control or input as to how that's going to be done. And in a way, as designers, we're putting our trust in the publisher that they know what they're doing and that they have a plan for what's going to happen for the game. Sadly, it happens far too often that there's a lot of excitement and work that goes into developing a game, and as a designer you're really excited to see it come out, and then you have no idea when the game is released, and you're only told by someone else when they see it on a shelf that the game was actually released. And not only does it mean the publisher didn't necessarily tell you about the release of the game, but the fact that I haven't heard anything about the game, I haven't heard any press or reviewers talking about the game, speaks to the publisher not having much of a plan to market the game. Related to the previous point about hiring professionals in that area, marketing is a specific skill set that's very valuable in the board game industry, and often it will require someone who has skills and experiences in that area. And ultimately, marketing can have a big influence on the overall success and longevity of a particular title in the marketplace, and that can have a transformative effect on a designer's life. Believe me, I would not have been able to become a full-time designer had it not been for a few of my games selling regularly and giving me regular income to remain a full-time designer. And that, in part, is down to the marketing efforts of the publishers that those games I worked on with. But in some ways, I was just lucky that it worked out like that. For every game that I think has been marketed well and has found its place in the marketplace, I've had many games that have been released that simply haven't had any effort put into at all into their release and trying to get it to sell well. And all the effort and blood, sweat and tears I put into making those games was effectively wasted. And now I have a game which was released but not many people bought, and even if I get the rights back to the game, it's hard to get another publisher interested in the game if they know that the previous release didn't sell very well, even if that had nothing to do with the quality of the game. This last point is a little bit more of a hope than anything, because I think it's hard for designers to have a direct impact on it. I'm not suggesting the publishers should have to tell designers about all their plans for marketing a game, or that they should be contractually obligated to do certain things. But I think improving the communication around this, maybe when the contract is being signed, and talking about how you see the game fitting in the marketplace, different ways that you might be able to market the game, what resources you as a publisher might be able to put into the game to help its release. All these things can help the designer, again, make an informed decision and have confidence that the game that you're all working on, not only you're going to make the best game possible, but that you're going to do all that you can for it to find its audience out in the wider world. So to all the designers who watched this video, what did you think? What are some of the experiences you've had with publishers that you think could be improved? Please share them down in the comments below, and we can hopefully discuss maybe things that could be improved in the industry that might not have happened to me, but definitely happened to you. And to any publishers who are watching this video, I hope that you've been able to take this as constructive feedback rather than criticism necessarily. And potentially it opens up conversations or new ideas about the ways that you might be able to work with designers as you go forward in your own publishing practice. And much like how I publish my income figures for how much money I earn from games, I really believe that increasing the amount of transparency and communication around these different issues in the board game design community can only help in terms of shining a light on maybe some practices that really could be better. But as always, thanks very much for watching, and all the best for your game designing and publishing. Bye.